My name is Bella Swan. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the woman people describe with words like steady, pleasant, and easy to work with. I live in a city where glass office buildings reflect the sky so perfectly that sometimes you forget what's solid and what's just an appearance. I work in a corporate environment that values polish, presentation, and the right tone in meetings. If you met me in passing, you might assume I'm quiet because I lack confidence. I avoid confrontation because I'm unsure of myself, that I don't speak up because I have nothing significant to add. I've learned that calm women are often mistaken for compliant ones. And for a long time, I let that misunderstanding exist. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic speeches in conference rooms or explosive showdowns. It's about something quieter than that. It's about what happens when a person who has been consistently overlooked decides to stop explaining herself. It's about how systems respond not to emotion but to consequences. For months, I documented behavior that most people would call minor. Comments that could be dismissed as jokes, assignments quietly reassigned, credits subtly redirected, meetings I was excluded from, even though the work was mine. When I brought it to human resources, I was met with polite nods and carefully neutral expressions. My complaint was acknowledged and then gently set aside. HR ignored my harassment complaint until I mentioned the word lawyer. That single word changed the temperature of every room I entered. Suddenly, everyone wanted a meeting. But this isn't a story about intimidation. It's about preparation. It's about what quiet looks like when it isn't weakness but restraint. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leak emails or slam doors. I simply stopped absorbing what wasn't mine to carry. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I went from being the reliable, invisible employee to someone whose silence made executives uncomfortable. I'll explain how I learned to document without dramatizing, to respond without reacting, and to step back without collapsing. This isn't a story about winning. It's about understanding power where it actually lives and how often we hand it away without realizing. If you've ever felt dismissed in a room where you knew you belonged, have you ever wondered what might happen if you stopped asking for permission to be taken seriously? If you had asked my colleagues to describe me a year ago, they would have smiled politely and said something safe. Bella, oh, she's great, super reliable. She's the one who keeps everything organized. She doesn't cause any issues. No one would have called me difficult. No one would have called me ambitious. No one would have called me threatening. I was the operational backbone of a department that liked to pretend it ran on innovation alone. Calendars, compliance checklists, vendor coordination, budget tracking, risk documentation, those were invisible tasks. They weren't glamorous enough for LinkedIn announcements. They didn't make it into quarterly town halls. But without them, nothing moved. And I made sure everything moved. At Crestline Digital, the culture was polished and progressive on the surface. Diversity panels, wellness workshops, carefully worded emails about psychological safety. I believed in that language at first. I believed that if something was wrong, there would be a process. That if a concern was raised, it would be handled with care. But in meetings, I noticed something subtle. When I spoke, people listened politely. When Daniel spoke Daniel, who often repeated my suggestions 10 minutes later, they nodded with enthusiasm. When I outlined a risk concern, it was labeled as cautious. When he framed the same concern as strategic foresight, it was called leadership. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it as an observation. Patterns reveal themselves quietly if you're paying attention. I was invited to meetings when logistics were involved. I was excluded when decisions were made. My name appeared in internal documents under supporting coordination. He appeared under initiative lead. No one openly disrespected me. That's what made it so difficult to articulate. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, just small shifts in credit, slight redirections in tone, occasional jokes about how I was the organized one while others were the big picture thinkers. It sounds harmless when you say it out loud, and maybe that's why I stayed quiet. I had grown up being the adaptable one, the child who didn't make trouble, the student teachers relied on to collect assignments, the friend who listened more than she spoke. There's a reward system for that kind of personality approval without spotlight. At 32, I was financially stable. I owned my condo. I had savings. I wasn't desperate for validation, but I did want respect. Not applause, just accuracy. The irony is that my competence became the reason I was overlooked. I made things look easy. I solved problems before they escalated. Executives rarely saw the fires because I put them out early. And so I became part of the infrastructure. Useful, predictable, quiet. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like gradual erasure. You're included, but not centered. Acknowledged, but not amplified. Trusted, but never elevated. I told myself it was temporary. That performance would speak for itself. That consistency would eventually translate into recognition. But performance doesn't speak. People do. And the people speaking weren't me. I remember one quarterly review when my manager, Eric, smiled warmly and said, "Bella, you're such a stabilizing presence. You keep everyone grounded." It was meant as praise. But what I heard was, "You're safe. You won't challenge us." They saw me as dependable support. The person who would stay late to finalize reports. The one who would quietly correct mistakes without documenting whose mistake it was. The employee who absorbed tension so meetings could remain smooth. They didn't see someone who was observing everything. They didn't see someone who understood policy manuals better than most of the leadership. They didn't see someone who was slowly realizing that being underestimated isn't neutral, it's strategic. It benefits someone, and as long as I accepted that role, it would never change. The version of me they were comfortable with was calm, capable, and contained. They had no reason to think that calm could also mean calculating. No reason to think that containment could also mean control. At that time, I wasn't planning anything dramatic. I wasn't angry enough for that. I was just noticing who interrupted me, noticing who redirected the credit, noticing who smiled a little too tightly when I asked procedural questions. I was the woman in the room taking notes. They assumed I was recording action items. They didn't realize I was also recording patterns. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's how these things begin, not with something outrageous, but with something deniable. We were preparing for a vendor transition that I had been coordinating for weeks. Contracts reviewed, compliance checks logged, risk assessments were documented in my black leather notebook before they ever made it into the system. It was my project and everything but the title. In the final presentation meeting, I walked through the operational timeline. Clean slide, clear contingencies, no drama. Halfway through, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, lightly, "Bella's great with details. I'll handle the strategic positioning piece." The room chuckled. It wasn't cruel laughter, just alignment. I paused for half a second longer than usual. Not enough to be awkward, just enough for me to feel it. The strategic positioning piece. The slide he clicked to was one I had drafted. The talking points he used were pulled directly from a summary memo I'd written and sent to him the night before. He didn't lie. He didn't say he created it. He just occupied it. After the meeting, Eric clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Excellent framing. That's the kind of big picture thinking leadership wants to see." I stood beside them holding my laptop, invisible but present. No one said I had done poorly. No one criticized me. They simply elevated someone else using my groundwork as scaffolding. That was the first small cut. I could have spoken up. I could have said, "Actually, I prepared that positioning analysis." But something in me resisted. Not fear calculation. If I corrected him in that moment, I would have been labeled sensitive, or territorial, or worse, insecure. Instead, I smiled. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote the date. I summarized the meeting. I listed the slide numbers. I saved the original drafts with timestamps in a separate folder at home. It felt excessive, but something inside me had shifted, not anger, just awareness. Over the next few weeks, similar moments accumulated. Emails where my input was forwarded without attribution. Brainstorming sessions where my suggestions were met with silence until someone else rephrased them. A team update where Daniel said, "We've been discussing," when he meant I had briefed him privately. Each incident was minor, individually harmless, collectively directional. What unsettled me wasn't just Daniel's behavior. It was the room's response, the ease with which everyone accepted the narrative, the comfort in seeing me as support and him as lead. Once, during a lighter moment in the office kitchen, he joked, "Bella keeps me organized. I'd be lost without her." It sounded complimentary, but it placed me beneath him in hierarchy, as if I were an accessory to his competence. Someone nearby laughed and added, "Every visionary needs a detail person." Visionary, detailed person. Labels are powerful. They solidify perception, and perception determines trajectory. I remember standing there, holding my coffee mug, smiling politely. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I didn't withdraw. I observed. That was the moment I realized something subtle. No one else was cataloging these interactions. No one else felt the slow erosion because it wasn't happening to them. And when you're the only one feeling something, you begin to question yourself. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe this is just how collaboration works. Maybe recognition isn't the point, but recognition isn't vanity. It's a record. It shapes promotions, raises, influence. The first small cut didn't bleed. It just marked, and what troubled me most was how quickly I adapted to it. I adjusted my expectations. I told myself impact mattered more than credit. I convinced myself that leadership would eventually notice the consistency behind the scenes. I didn't realize yet that invisibility, when left unchallenged, becomes precedent, and precedent becomes permission. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't demand an immediate response. They test what you'll tolerate. The strange thing about repeated disrespect is that it rarely announces itself as such. It arrives dressed as culture, as humor, as just how things are. After that first meeting, the pattern didn't explode. It settled in, like background noise. You eventually stop hearing, except I didn't stop hearing it. I just stopped reacting. In weekly check-ins, Daniel would summarize our progress and then subtly highlight his own decisions. When I clarified timelines or flagged risks, he'd respond with, "Right, that's what I meant." Even when it wasn't, Eric began looping Daniel into strategic conversations. I wasn't invited to conversations that directly affected projects I was managing. I would find out later through forwarded emails or passing remarks. I told myself it was a hierarchy, that maybe this was simply how growth worked. Maybe I was being groomed for something stable, not visible. It's remarkable how persuasive rationalization can be when you want to preserve peace. Once, in a cross-department meeting, I presented a compliance concern regarding vendor data storage. It was specific, documented, preventable. There was a brief silence. Then someone from legal said, "Is that actually a risk, or are we being overly cautious?" Overly cautious? The phrase landed softly but decisively. Daniel leaned forward and reframed my concern as an opportunity to strengthen long-term positioning. The same issue, different packaging. Suddenly, it was thoughtful, not excessive. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the shift. I smiled again. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk. "Don't take it personally," he said casually. "Sometimes it's about tone." Tone. I nodded. Of course. But I replayed it that evening. My tone had been measured. Calm. Neutral. What he meant wasn't tone. He meant delivery authority. And authority is often granted based on perception, not substance. Over time, the small moments accumulated into something heavier, not dramatic, but persistent. Meeting notes circulated with Daniel's name bolded under lead. Mine appeared under support. When deadlines were met, the congratulations emails went to him first. I was CC'd. When something went wrong, a delayed approval, a vendor miscommunication, I was asked to look into it. There was no overt hostility, no insults, no obvious violations of policy, just a narrowing of space. I began noticing how often I preemptively softened my language. I might be wrong, but just a thought. Maybe we could consider. I had been trained socially, professionally to cushion my expertise, to make it palatable, and each time I did, it reinforced the role they had already assigned me. Reliable? Helpful, non-threatening. I stayed late more often. Not because I had to, but because I didn't want to give anyone a reason to question my commitment. I double-checked deliverables before sending them. I corrected minor errors in shared documents without pointing out who made them. I absorbed friction, and here's the uncomfortable truth: part of me took pride in that. In being the one who could handle it without complaint. In being steady when others were reactive, but steadiness when unacknowledged becomes assumed, and the assumed value becomes undervalued. One afternoon, during performance feedback, Eric said, "Bella, you're indispensable. The team relies on you." Indispensable. It sounds powerful, but it's a trap if it's not paired with mobility. If you're indispensable where you are, no one moves you. I left that meeting unsettled, not angry, just aware that the ceiling above me wasn't made of glass. It was made of narrative. They had decided who I was in the ecosystem, and I had quietly agreed. That realization was harder to sit with than any single slight, because it meant the pattern wasn't only external, it was reinforced by my silence. Not because I was weak, but because I believed patients would be rewarded. I didn't yet understand that systems don't correct what benefits them. They normalize it, and I had been normalized. There's a moment quiet, almost invisible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it happened during a planning retreat. Crestline rented a sleek conference space overlooking the water. Glass walls, catered lunch, flip charts positioned like symbols of collaboration. It was meant to feel forward-thinking, energized. I arrived early, as usual. I set up the name placards, tested the projector, printed extra copies of the agenda in case someone forgot theirs. No one asked me to do those things. They just assumed I would. When Daniel walked in, he glanced around approvingly. "Perfect, Bella. You always think of everything," it was said warmly. But it wasn't gratitude. It was an expectation. As the day unfolded, I began to notice the choreography of it all. When discussions drifted, eyes turned to Daniel to redirect. When logistics needed clarifying, eyes turned to me. At one point, an executive from another department asked a pointed question about long-term expansion strategy. Daniel answered confidently, broad strokes, confident tone. Then he glanced at me. "Bella can handle the implementation details." Handle, like I was a function. Later, during a breakout session, I overheard someone say, "She's the glue. Every team needs a glue person. Glue holds things together. Glue doesn't lead." That was the role. Reliable, useful, invisible. I felt it settle in not as an insult, but as a structure. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed complexity and translated it into action, the one who prevented embarrassment before it surfaced. There's dignity in that work, but there's also confinement, because once you're labeled the glue, no one imagines you as the architect. I realized something uncomfortable that afternoon. My competence had made others comfortable. Comfortable not giving me credit. Comfortable not inviting me into strategic conversations. Comfortable assuming I would stay. I had become predictable, and predictability in corporate ecosystems is often mistaken for a lack of ambition. The truth is, I did have ambition. It just wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. I didn't crave a spotlight. I wanted influence aligned with contribution, but influence requires narrative control, and the narrative wasn't mine. On the drive home that evening, I replayed small moments from the retreat. Daniel positioned himself at the head of the table without discussion, the way Eric deferred to him instinctively, the way I was asked to capture next steps instead of shaping them. I wasn't being attacked. I was being assigned, and I had accepted the assignment through silence. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you understand the role others expect you to play, you have two options: perform it flawlessly forever, or redefine it. The problem with redefining a role is that it disrupts comfort, and people rarely respond calmly when comfort is threatened. I went home, opened my black leather notebook, and wrote a single sentence at the top of a new page. What would happen if I stopped being glue? Not dramatic, not confrontational, just a question. Because if I were truly indispensable, then my absence from certain tasks, from certain emotional labor, would be noticeable. And if it wasn't noticeable, then the value I thought I had might only exist in my own mind. That's when I began to understand something Subtle invisibility isn't always imposed. Sometimes it's maintained. And I had maintained mine with professionalism, patience, and silence. The role they assigned me was safe. But safety, I realized, can also be stagnation. And I was beginning to feel the weight of it. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the quiet space between two emails. I was at my desk reviewing a draft proposal Daniel had just sent to senior leadership. My name wasn't on it. The structure was mine. The risk matrix was mine. Even the phrasing in the executive summary was lifted almost verbatim from a document I had shared internally the week before. But this time, something felt different. Not sharper, not more insulting, just clear. I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel outraged. I felt awake. There's a difference. I leaned back in my chair and read the email again. Slowly. I watched how he framed the narrative. After reviewing the operational landscape, I've determined it was smooth, confident, unquestioned. I opened my sent folder. There was my original memo, timestamped, detailed, structured. For the first time, instead of feeling that familiar flicker of resignation, I felt something steadier. I realized I had been waiting for someone to notice, waiting for fairness to correct itself, waiting for leadership to organically recognize patterns, waiting for merit to surface naturally. But merit doesn't float to the top in environments shaped by perception. It's positioned, and I had never positioned myself. That afternoon, HR sent a company-wide reminder about respectful workplace communication. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, I had tolerated behavior that hovered in the gray zone, never explicit enough to be called harassment, but persistent enough to erode. I remembered the initial conversation I'd had with HR weeks earlier. When I cautiously mentioned feeling excluded from strategic conversations tied to my own work, the representative had smiled sympathetically and said, "Sometimes it's just about finding your voice in the room." Finding my voice, as if I had misplaced it. I didn't argue then. I didn't escalate. I left that meeting with the quiet understanding that nothing would change unless something forced it to. But on that Tuesday, I stopped hoping it would change on its own. The shift wasn't loud, it was internal. I stopped personalizing. I stopped asking, why are they doing this to me? And started asking, what does this system reward? The answer was visibility, confidence, and documented influence. Not silent competence. So I made a decision not to confront, not to accuse, not to threaten. I decided to observe differently. Instead of staying late to preemptively solve problems, I let minor issues surface before stepping in. Not recklessly, not maliciously, just without overextending. Instead of softening my language in meetings, I began speaking in declarative sentences. This creates a compliance risk. This timeline isn't feasible without additional support. This was my original framework. No emotion, just clarity. I also began forwarding key documents with explicit language. As discussed, here's the strategy draft I prepared outlining the positioning Daniel will present. Subtle, precise, time-stamped. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I was trying to realign the record with reality. The shift felt less like rebellion and more like recalibration. And something else happened. That week I started documenting everything. Not just in my notebook, but in structured folders at home. Emails, meeting summaries, draft histories, performance reviews. Not because I planned to use them, but because I understood something now. Power responds to documentation, not feelings, not fairness. Documentation, for the first time in months, I felt steady again. Not invisible strategic. They still saw me as glue. They still assumed I would absorb. But inside, something had hardened, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I wasn't going to argue about my value anymore. I was going to measure it. And if the measurement didn't align with the recognition, I would stop donating my silence. That Tuesday, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. But internally, I stopped waiting. And when you stop waiting, you start choosing. Silence feels very different when it's no longer automatic. Before, I had been quiet because it was easier, because I didn't want to disrupt harmony, because I believed patience was a strength. Now, I was quiet because I was measuring. That distinction changed everything. In meetings, I stopped filling awkward gaps. When someone proposed an unrealistic deadline, I didn't rush to restructure it in real time to make it feasible. I let the room sit with the weight of what they were asking. Silence, I learned, creates space, and space reveals who is actually responsible. When Daniel volunteered ambitious timelines without consulting me, I simply asked, "What resources are allocated to support that no edge in my voice?" Just a question. He would glance at me, slightly irritated, then say something vague about efficiency. I would nod and write it down. Write it down. They still saw me as the detail person, the one taking notes. They didn't realize that documentation, when consistent, becomes leverage. I stopped preemptively solving problems that weren't mine. If a cross-team request came through without clarity, I replied with structured questions instead of immediate execution. Can you confirm the scope? Who owns final approval? Please provide the agreed timeline in writing. Polite, professional, unavoidable. At first light, the team interpreted my shift as stress. Everything okay? One colleague asked gently after a meeting where I spoke less than usual. Completely, I said, and I meant it. Because I wasn't withdrawing out of hurt. I was recalibrating energy. There's a misconception that silence signals weakness. The person speaking least has the least power. But silence, when chosen, unsettles people who rely on predictability. Daniel began sending me more direct messages, clarifying his talking points before meetings. He wasn't asking for input. He was seeking reassurance. I responded briefly, "Noted," or "I'll document accordingly." That word document started appearing in my vocabulary more often. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk and said, half joking, "You've gotten very formal lately." I smiled. Just aligning with process. Process is neutral. It's difficult to argue with. HR loves process. Leadership respects process, and process leaves a paper trail. Silence also forced something else to surface discomfort. Without my usual smoothing, small inefficiencies became visible. A vendor delay escalated because I didn't quietly expedite it behind the scenes. A scheduling conflict arose with Eric because I didn't rearrange 5 calendars without acknowledgement. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stopped overfunctioning. And when friction appeared, it was treated as surprising. "Why wasn't this flagged earlier?" Eric asked during one call. "It was," I replied calmly. In the risk assessment I shared on March 12th, I sent the attachment again, time-stamped. No accusation, no tone, just record. The room went quiet for a few seconds longer than usual. That's when I realized something critical my previous silence had protected more than just myself. It had protected reputations. By absorbing mistakes and correcting them quietly, I had shielded others from visibility. Now, visibility was redistributing itself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. Silence had become a boundary. I wasn't withholding effort. I was aligning it with accountability. And slowly, subtly, the dynamic shifted. Not dramatically, just enough that people started being more careful with their language around me. Daniel no longer casually referenced our strategy without clarifying ownership. Eric began CCing me on threads that previously bypassed me. It wasn't respected yet. It was caution. And caution is often the first sign that perception is changing. They still believed I was non-confrontational. They were right, but they were beginning to sense that I was no longer unguarded. Silence, when unchosen, erases you. Silence, when chosen, positions you. And I was positioning. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. While everyone adjusted to my quieter, more procedural tone, I was building something they couldn't see structure. Not to destroy anyone, not to humiliate anyone. To protect myself with precision, I began each morning the same way: review emails, flag inconsistencies, and archive key threads to a private folder at home. I created a simple spreadsheet, not emotional, not accusatory, just columns. Date, event, witnesses, documentation available, impact. The first few entries felt almost unnecessary. A comment reframed, a meeting exclusion, a decision made without the project owner present. But when you view isolated incidents side by side, patterns stop being subjective. They become systemic. I also reread the company's employee handbook, every section on harassment, hostile work environment, retaliation, promotion criteria, and escalation pathways. It wasn't a dramatic reading. It was technical, dense, but I highlighted phrases: consistent marginalization, pattern of credit misappropriation, exclusion from work-related opportunities tied to role responsibilities. Language matters. The same experiences that felt minor in conversation had formal definitions in policy. I scheduled a second meeting with HR not to complain, but to seek clarity on role alignment. That was the phrasing I used in the calendar invite. The HR representative, Melissa, smiled in the same measured way she had before. "How can we support you, Bella?" I came prepared. Printed example, neutral tone. "I've observed repeated instances where work product I've created is presented without attribution," I said calmly. "Additionally, I've been excluded from strategic meetings directly tied to my deliverables. I'd like to understand how role visibility is determined." I didn't accuse Daniel of harassment. I didn't use emotionally charged language. I used documentation. Melissa nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes collaboration blurs lines." "Understood," I replied. "That's why I've compiled specific examples with dates and outcomes." I slid the pages across the table. Her posture shifted slightly, not alarmed, but attentive. "Documentation changes energy." She assured me they would look into it. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. No follow-up meeting. No formal acknowledgement beyond a polite email thanking me for raising concerns. That's when clarity deepened. HR wasn't ignoring me because they disliked me. They were protecting stability, and stability often favors those already positioned as leaders. So I expanded my preparation. I consulted publicly available resources on workplace law. Not in panic, in education. I learned about documentation standards, about the burden of proof, about what constitutes retaliation. I didn't contact a lawyer. Not yet. But I understood what that process would require, and I made sure I could meet it. At work, I maintained composure, delivered tasks on time, responded promptly, kept my tone neutral, but I stopped offering emotional labor. I no longer reassured Daniel before presentations. I no longer softened emails to protect egos. I no longer volunteered for projects that wouldn't be visible, and something subtle happened. Small cracks began appearing in their confidence. Without my quiet scaffolding, Daniel's presentations became less structured. He missed minor compliance nuances I would have flagged earlier. Nothing catastrophic, just noticeable. Eric began asking more detailed follow-up questions. "Bella, can you confirm that's aligned with regulatory guidance?" Yes, I would say evenly. I outlined that in the initial framework. I always referenced the origin, never with edge, always with facts. The preparation wasn't about revenge. It was about inevitability. If I ever needed to escalate formally, I wanted it to be clean. Undeniable, pattern-based, not emotional. What they never noticed was that my silence had shifted from accommodation to audit. I wasn't waiting for them to correct course anymore. I was determining whether the environment itself was sustainable. Because once you prepare fully, you remove fear. And when fear disappears, your decisions become irreversible. The moment of leverage didn't arrive with adrenaline. It arrived with stillness. It was late on a Thursday evening. The office had mostly emptied out. Lights dimmed to that soft, after-hours glow that makes everything feel slightly unreal. I was reviewing a shared drive folder, cross-checking version histories on a strategy deck that Daniel was set to present to the executive board the following week. I wasn't searching for anything dramatic. I was confirming authorship. That's when I noticed it. The document properties hadn't been cleaned. My name was embedded in the original metadata, creation date, edit timestamps, even track changes that had been superficially accepted, but not fully removed from the back-end version history. I sat back in my chair and just looked at the screen. There it was. Not a feeling, not a perception, proof. Not just of contribution, but of pattern. Because it wasn't one file. It was several. Across multiple projects. Strategy outlines, risk assessments, and financial projections. Each time, the final presentation had Daniel listed as the lead author. Each time, the structural architecture was mine. I didn't smile. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. Clarity is quiet. I exported copies of the version histories, saved PDFs of tracked changes, backed up email threads where I had sent initial drafts with timestamps. Everything is organized chronologically. No commentary, no interpretation. Just record. As I continued reviewing, I found something else, an email from Eric to Daniel discussing promotion tracks. In it, Eric wrote, "Your strategic ownership this quarter positions you well for senior leadership consideration." Strategic ownership. Attached to that email was the very deck whose foundation I had built. I read the message twice, and for the first time, the emotional layer was fully detached. This wasn't about personality, or tone, or misunderstanding. It was about advancement built on silent labor. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet office for a long moment. There's a specific kind of calm that comes when you realize you are no longer guessing. Guessing keeps you anxious. Evidence steadies you. I drove home that night without music, replaying the implications. If I escalated formally, I now had documented proof of misattribution. If I chose to leave, I had enough material to negotiate leverage. If I did nothing, the pattern would solidify into promotion for him. That was the decision point forming in the distance. But first, I needed confirmation. The next day, I sent a neutral email to Daniel. "Hi, Daniel. I noticed some of the strategy decks still list you as the sole author despite originating from shared drafts. For clarity, can we align attribution going forward? No accusation, just alignment." His response came an hour later. "Bella, we're a team. Attribution isn't that granular at the leadership level. Let's not get caught up in semantics." Semantics. I reread that word several times. Semantics is interpretation. Metadata is a fact. That was the private reveal. Not the version history, not the email, but the realization that he believed this was inconsequential, that he assumed I wouldn't escalate, that he was comfortable dismissing documented authorship as semantics. That confidence told me everything. I didn't reply emotionally. I forwarded the thread to my personal archive. Then I scheduled a third meeting with HR. Subject line: formal follow-up documented pattern of misattribution. I didn't mention lawyers. I didn't threaten. I simply attached the evidence. In that moment, I wasn't angry. I was finished negotiating reality. Leverage doesn't feel powerful. It feels heavy, because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. And the next step, whatever it is, will change the landscape permanently. There's a moment when preparation stops being theoretical. When you realize you are no longer collecting information, you are choosing a direction. After I sent that formal follow-up email to HR, attaching version histories and documenting patterns of misattribution, something in me settled. Not relief. Finality. Melissa responded within a day this time. The tone was different, more formal. She scheduled a meeting and included a representative from legal. Legal. That was new. The meeting itself was measured. Professional, no raised voices, no defensiveness on the surface. "We take these concerns seriously," Melissa said, hands folded neatly on the table. "I understand." I replied, "That's why I've structured everything chronologically." The legal representative asked clarifying questions. "Were these attribution concerns raised previously?" "Yes," I said calmly. "On 2 prior occasions. Informally and formally. Were you excluded from strategic meetings tied to your deliverables?" "Yes." "I've listed specific dates." I answered without emotion, because this wasn't about convincing them of how I felt. It was about establishing a record. When the meeting ended, they said they would conduct an internal review. Internal review. It sounded procedural, controlled, self-contained, and that's when the decision fully formed. I had 3 options. First, I could wait. Trust the internal process, allow the company to investigate itself and determine whether a senior male employee's advancement had been built partially on my work without acknowledgement. Second, I could escalate, externally consult an employment attorney, file a formal complaint beyond HR, initiate a process that would inevitably strain every professional relationship I had in that building. Third, I could leverage what I knew quietly, negotiate a departure package, protect my reputation, and walk away on my own terms. None of the options was dramatic. All of them were irreversible. That's the part people rarely discuss. Once you formalize a pattern of misattribution and marginalization, you cannot return to being the glue. Even if the investigation concludes politely, even if apologies are offered, trust doesn't reset. I went home that evening and opened my notebook. I wrote 3 columns. Stay, fight, leave. Under stay, I wrote monitor outcome, risk of subtle retaliation, slow change. Under fight, I wrote legal process, stress, public record, potential systemic change. Under leave, I wrote control narrative, financial negotiation, clean exit. I didn't rush the decision. I calculated. Financially, I was stable. I had savings, no dependence, no immediate pressure. Professionally, my documentation could support either an internal correction or external escalation. Emotionally, I asked myself a harder question. Did I want to win inside this system, or did I want to stop participating in it? Winning would mean forcing acknowledgement. Leaving would mean redefining success entirely. 2 days later, before HR concluded their review, I scheduled a consultation with an employment attorney. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't threaten. I simply informed myself of my rights. The attorney reviewed my documentation quietly. "You've been thorough," she said. "That was intentional." She nodded. "You have a strong case for formal misattribution and potential gender-based marginalization. Whether you pursue it depends on your objective." Objective? That word clarified everything. My objective wasn't punishment. It was alignment. And alignment in that environment no longer seemed possible. So I made the irreversible choice. I authorized the attorney to draft a formal notice to the company, not a lawsuit. A pre-litigation communication outlining documented patterns and requesting mediated resolution. It included one word that shifts corporate posture instantly. Lawyer. I didn't send it personally. It went through proper legal channels. And then I waited, not anxiously, just aware that the temperature in that building was about to change. The letter was sent on a Monday morning. I didn't walk into the office differently. I didn't avoid eye contact. I didn't watch for reactions, because the reaction wouldn't be immediate. Legal correspondence doesn't explode. It circulates, quietly. My attorney's notice was structured, precise, and restrained. It outlined documented instances of misattribution, exclusion from role-aligned strategic meetings, and HR's prior awareness. It did not accuse anyone of malicious intent. It did not threaten public exposure. It requested formal mediation. And it used the word lawyer exactly once where it needed to be. That was enough. At 9:14 a.m., the email reached the company's general counsel. By 10:02, it had been forwarded to the CEO. By 11:30, my calendar invitation arrived. Subject line alignment discussion. Participants Eric, Melissa from HR, general counsel. Suddenly, everyone wanted a meeting. The speed was almost mathematical. Weeks of polite inaction had been replaced by same-day urgency. I didn't smile when I saw the invite. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt confirmed. Power doesn't move for discomfort. It moves for liability. I accepted the meeting. In the hours before it, nothing outward shifted. Daniel still messaged about presentation edits. A teammate asked about a vendor contract. The office hum remained steady. But under that surface, I knew conversations were happening without me. Risk assessment, exposure evaluation, containment planning. At 2:00 p.m., I entered the conference room carrying only my notebook. No printed accusations, no dramatic folder. They began formally. "We received communication from your legal representative," General Counsel said evenly. "Yes," I replied. "We're concerned this escalated externally before internal processes concluded." I held his gaze. Internal processes had been initiated twice previously without resolution. Silence. Not tense, just recalibrating. Melissa leaned forward. "Bella, we wish you had expressed the seriousness more clearly." "I did," I said calmly. "I provided documentation. I followed protocol. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse." I referenced. The difference in posture around the table was unmistakable. Eric was quieter than I'd ever seen him. Daniel was not present. That was intentional. General Counsel shifted tone. "We'd like to understand your objective here." Objective? The same word the attorney had used? My objective is accurate attribution, correction of documented patterns, and protection from retaliation, I said. Preferably through mediation, not punishment, not headlines. Process? They asked if I was seeking financial damages. "I'm seeking resolution," I replied. That answer unsettled them more than a demand would have, because demands are negotiable. Resolution implies structural change. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. No conclusions, just acknowledgement. As I left, Melissa said softly, "This has become more serious than we anticipated." I paused briefly. It was always serious. I said, documentation doesn't make something serious. It reveals that it already was. And that was the shift. For months, my words alone carried little weight. But once accompanied by legal representation, they were treated as credible risks. I didn't feel empowered. I felt informed. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk, looking unsettled. "Did you involve a lawyer?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, for what his voice was restrained, not angry, confused. "For documentation alignment and mediation." He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to reconcile the woman he thought I was with the one sitting in front of him. I offered nothing more. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't being mistaken for weakness. It was being recognized as control. The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was subtle disorientation. By Wednesday morning, Daniel's usual confidence had thinned. Not vanished, just recalibrated. He no longer summarized our strategy in open forums without carefully glancing at me first. His language shifted. "This was developed in collaboration with Bella," he said during a team update. Collaboration? It was the first time my name had appeared in a sentence like that without prompting. No one reacted outwardly, but I felt the ripple. Eric began including me in strategic planning calls that previously excluded me. My calendar, once filled with execution tasks, now showed vision sync and leadership alignment. The invitations felt less like inclusion and more like damage control. That distinction mattered. HR sent a follow-up email outlining a formal review process and requesting additional documentation. The tone was precise, careful, almost rehearsed. Before the lawyer's letter, my concerns were abstract. Now they were at risk. Colleagues sensed something had shifted, even if they didn't know why. Conversations quieted slightly when I entered shared spaces. Not hostile, just cautious. The casual jokes about detail people disappeared entirely. Language tightened. Daniel avoided one-on-one conversations unless they were documented by email. I noticed he CC'd Eric more frequently. Meetings that used to feel fluid now felt structured. No one mentioned the word lawyer out loud. But it hovered. What fascinated me wasn't their anxiety. It was their sudden attentiveness. A project proposal went out on Friday with clear attribution lines, strategy framework, Isabella Swan, executive summary, Daniel Brooks financial modeling, joint. Accuracy had become a priority. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt studious. Because once someone signals they understand systems beyond the surface, people adjust around them. Eric requested a private meeting. "Bella," he began carefully, "I want to say we value your contributions deeply. If there were oversights, they were unintentional. Unintentional, it's a comforting word. It protects the ego. I'm not questioning intention," I replied calmly. "I'm addressing impact." That distinction unsettled him more than the accusation would have. Impact requires correction. He asked if I would consider resolving this internally without formal mediation. I chose my words precisely. I'm open to solutions that include documented structural adjustments. Structural? That word shifted the room again, because structural changes outlast apologies. The consequences continued unfolding in small ways. A promotion announcement that had been rumored for weeks was quietly delayed. Daniel's name was absent from the internal newsletter that Friday. Instead, it paused. The message read, "Leadership role evaluations are under review." Under review. I didn't celebrate. I went home that evening and sat with an unexpected emotion, not triumph, not relief. Grief. Not for Daniel. For the version of my career that might have existed if credit had been aligned from the beginning. For the months I had spent questioning myself instead of questioning the system. The office atmosphere had changed. But so had something else. Trust. Even if this resolved in my favor, I knew I would never again be the invisible stabilizer, the neutral glue, the quietly accommodating presence. Once you invoke formal accountability, you alter relational chemistry permanently. Colleagues who once saw me as safe now saw me as capable of escalation. And while that brought caution, it also created distance. That was the cost. Consequences don't just fall on those who caused harm. They reshape everyone involved. I walked into the office the following Monday. Aware that the environment was no longer passive, it was observing me as closely as I had observed it, and the review process had only just begun. The panic didn't erupt. It surfaced in fragments. An urgent email thread marked high importance, A rescheduled executive meeting. A closed-door conversation that lasted longer than usual. By the second week of the formal review, the atmosphere at Crestline had shifted from caution to calculation. I was invited to a mediation session with an external consultant, someone neutral, someone whose presence alone signaled that this was no longer an internal misunderstanding. Daniel attended. It was the first time we had sat across from each other since the lawyer's notice. He looked composed, tired, maybe, but controlled. The consultant began by summarizing the documented concerns repeated misattribution of authored materials, exclusion from role-aligned strategic conversations, and prior HR notification without resolution. Hearing it spoken aloud, structured, neutral, chronological was surreal, not because it exaggerated anything, because it distilled it. Daniel spoke carefully. There was never any intention to minimize Bella's contributions. We operate collaboratively. Collaboratively. The word felt different now. I responded evenly. Collaboration implies shared visibility. The documentation reflects consistent singular attribution. No emotion, just a fact. The consultant asked whether I believed the pattern was malicious. I paused deliberately. I believed the pattern was beneficial, I said, and therefore unexamined. That sentence hung in the room longer than any accusation could have. Beneficial systems rarely self-correct. The review findings were delivered a week later. HR acknowledged inconsistent attribution practices and insufficient role clarity in strategic forums. They recommended updated authorship guidelines, clearer documentation protocols, and leadership training. Guidelines, adjustments. It was all very corporate, very controlled, and yet something irreversible had already happened. Daniel's anticipated promotion was formally postponed, pending leadership evaluation. Eric's management oversight was cited in the report. Crestline announced a company-wide revision to project documentation standards. From the outside, it looked like progress, but inside the room where it mattered, something else was clear. Trust had fractured. Daniel approached me privately after the findings were released. "I wish you had just talked to me," he said quietly. I held his gaze. I did. He looked away first. That's when I understood something important. It wasn't that they didn't hear me before. It was that they didn't believe I would escalate. Now they did. Eric called me into his office later that week. "We want you to feel supported here," he said carefully. "We're prepared to adjust your title and compensation to reflect your strategic contributions." There it was. The correction. Late but tangible. 6 months earlier, that offer might have felt like validation. Now it felt like containment, because the decision point had already passed. I listened politely, asked for the terms in writing, thanked him. But internally, I knew something they didn't. Even if everything was fixed, I would never unlearn how quickly my documentation was dismissed before legal risk entered the equation. That knowledge changes how you see an institution. Too late to fix it doesn't mean no improvement occurred. It means the improvement arrived only under pressure, and pressure reveals priority. They were willing to adjust policies. They were willing to adjust titles. But they had not been willing to adjust perception until liability was involved. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me certain, because once you see how power responds, you can't unknow it. And I was no longer interested in staying where my credibility required legal reinforcement. The system was correcting itself, but I had already corrected my trajectory. The final confrontation didn't happen in mediation. It happened in Eric's office on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the official findings were released. The blinds were half drawn. The light was soft, diffused. It felt almost staged, like a setting prepared for something delicate. Eric closed the door gently behind me. "We formalized the new title," he began. "Director of Strategic Operations. Compensation adjusted accordingly. Public announcement ready for Monday." He slid the printed document across the desk. It was generous. Objectively, it was what I had been working toward for years. Recognition, authority, alignment between contribution and position. 6 months ago, I might have felt gratitude so strong it bordered on relief. Now, I felt clarity. "I appreciate the correction," I said calmly. "Correction, not opportunity, not promotion. Correction." He nodded slowly. "We want you here, Bella." This situation escalated in ways that caught us off guard. I held his gaze. It escalated when documentation met consequence. There was no accusation in my voice, just sequence. He exhaled. "Daniel's leadership path is under review. He's taken responsibility. Responsibility. Another comforting word. What does that look like? I asked evenly. Shared authorship standards, oversight adjustments, mentorship, structural improvements. Structural. I recognized the vocabulary now. It was careful. Design. I nodded once. I'm glad the policies are changing. He hesitated, but there it was. The quiet invitation for reassurance. No, but I said, just timing. He leaned back slightly. What does that mean? It was the first time I allowed a small silence to stretch not as a strategy, but as honesty. It means the environment is improving, I said, but my relationship to it has changed. He studied me carefully. Are you planning to leave? He asked. Voice lower. I'm evaluating alignment, I replied. That was the confrontation. No raised voices, no emotional release. Just two professionals acknowledging that something foundational had shifted. Later that afternoon, Daniel asked if we could talk. We met in a small conference room, neutral space. He looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. I never meant to take credit, he said. I just assumed we were operating as a team. Teams share visibility, I replied. He swallowed slightly. You could have told me it bothered you. I did, I said gently. He didn't argue. Silence settled between us, not hostile, not warm, just real. I underestimated you, he admitted finally. I tilted my head slightly. In what way? I didn't think you'd go that far. Involve process, involve the law, involve consequence. I nodded once. That was the point. Not to punish him, to correct the trajectory. He looked down at the table. Are we okay? It was such a human question, and the answer wasn't simple. We're clear, I said. Clarity is better than comfort. He accepted that. No handshake, no dramatic reconciliation, just understanding. The confrontation ended without heat because heat wasn't necessary. The facts had already done the work. And as I walked back to my desk, I realized something subtle but powerful. For the first time in that building, no one saw me as glue. They saw me as gravity, not loud, not volatile, but capable of shifting everything when necessary. The title was announced on Monday. Director of Strategic Operations. My name is in bold. My role was described in language that finally matched the work I had been doing all along. The congratulations came quickly, emails, Slack messages, a brief round of applause in the weekly meeting. It was respectful, professional, measured. 6 months earlier, I would have interpreted it as an arrival. Now, I understand it as acknowledgement delayed, negotiated, secured through documentation rather than assumption. I stood in front of the team that morning and thanked them. My voice is steady. My tone is neutral. I'm committed to structural clarity and shared visibility. I said, that benefits everyone. I meant it. Because this was never about humiliation. It was about accuracy. But as the week unfolded, something inside me remained calm in a way that felt detached from the title itself. The role had changed. I had changed more. Colleagues treated me differently now. Not warmly different, respectfully different. Language around me was more precise. Attribution is more careful. Invitations more inclusive. Caution had matured into recognition. Yet the building felt smaller. Not physically, psychologically. Once you see how power shifts under pressure, you begin to understand its mechanics. And once you understand its mechanics, you stop romanticizing it. I no longer mistook polite culture for ethical culture. I no longer equated inclusion with equity. And most importantly, I no longer needed external validation to confirm my competence. That part had solidified the day I chose consequence over comfort. 2 weeks after the announcement, I submitted my resignation. Not abruptly, not emotionally. Strategically, I gave proper notice, offered transition plans, documented ongoing initiatives, ensured the structural changes I had advocated for were embedded before I left. Eric looked genuinely surprised when I told him, "You just fought to correct this," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied, "and it's corrected." "Then why leave?" "Because correction under pressure is not the same as alignment by default." "I didn't say it that way," I said, "because I've outgrown the version of myself that needed to stay." That was the truth. The quiet woman who absorbed and rationalized had evolved into someone who understood leverage, boundaries, and consequence. And staying, no matter how improved the environment, would anchor me to a chapter that required legal reinforcement to respect my voice I didn't want to build the next stage of my life inside a system that had only adjusted when forced. Leaving wasn't bitter. It was autonomy. On my final day, I packed my desk slowly. The black leather notebook slid into my bag last. Daniel stopped by briefly. I learned a lot, he said. I hope so, I replied gently. Not sharp, not soft, just steady. When I walked out of the building, there was no dramatic music playing in my head. No cinematic slow motion moment. Just clarity. I hadn't destroyed anything. I hadn't exposed anyone publicly. I hadn't shouted or humiliated or demanded spectacle. I had documented, I had aligned, I had chosen, and now I was someone who understood that quiet does not mean passive. It means controlled. When people hear this story, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending. They expect anger, or a public downfall, or a triumphant speech that leaves everyone stunned. That's not what happened. No one was fired. No one was publicly disgraced. There were no viral posts, no headlines, no courtroom battles. There was documentation. There was a single word lawyer that shifted attention where months of polite explanation had not. And there was a quiet decision to leave once the lesson had been learned. If there's a moral here, it isn't about revenge. It's about understanding how systems respond. Many workplaces speak the language of fairness, inclusion, respect, but language without consequence often stays theoretical. The moment documentation meets liability, priorities clarify. That doesn't mean every situation requires legal escalation. It means silence without strategy benefits the structure more than it benefits you. For a long time, I believed patience was the highest form of professionalism, that if I worked hard enough, stayed calm enough, avoided conflict carefully enough, recognition would naturally follow. But performance doesn't automatically correct narrative. Documentation does. Boundaries do. Consequence does. The most important shift wasn't external, it was internal. I stopped waiting to be seen and started recording what was already visible. I stopped arguing feelings and started aligning facts. I stopped confusing harmony with health. And here's something I want to say gently. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to humiliate anyone to reclaim space. You don't even have to stay. Sometimes. Quiet dominance is simply this. You understand the system. You document the pattern. You choose your move. And you don't announce it until it's already in motion. I left with my reputation intact. My confidence is intact. And a deeper understanding of how easily capable people, especially women who are calm and competent, are mistaken for compliant. They weren't prepared for me to escalate. Not because I was incapable, but because I had never needed to before. So now I'll leave you with one question. If you've ever been underestimated in a room where you know you belong, would you rather be liked in the short term or aligned in the long term?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.